Welcome to the Sirius report. This is Paul, and we're assessing why Russia could now officially declare war on Ukraine. Declaring war is a world of difference in military terms than a special military operation. We've spoken about this numerous occasions previously, and as a result of Ukrainian action, there will now have to be consideration given in Moscow as to what the Russian response will be, and we'll come on to what that is in a minute. And consequently, because of the nature of this attack by the Ukrainians, there is an argument that would say Russia would regard this as sufficient grounds and in terms of international law to declare war officially on Ukraine. Whether they do is an entirely different matter, and we're not a decision maker, clearly, but we're going to lay out the reasons why Russia would consider this as legitimate grounds. And it relates to the fact there was a direct attack on Russia's nuclear strategic assets, or part of what is termed Russia's nuclear triad. Ironically, it comes one day before talks in Istanbul that were supposed to end the war. So was this a clear indication? And it comes back to our point, there are elements in Ukraine who want the war to carry on forever because they want the gravy train to carry on forever. Now, there are comments attributed to Ukraine's security service, the SBU, who stated that they were conducting a large-scale special operation to destroy enemy, meaning Russian, bomber aviation in Russia's rear. Now, if that statement that is attributed to the SBU is confirmed, then in essence, Ukraine would have officially taken responsibility for an attack on a component, not all of it clearly, of Russia's nuclear triad. The argument, therefore, would be then that the Kremlin could view the strikes on Russia's nuclear triad as an attack on Russia's national security, and that therefore would lead to an escalation of the conflict, meaning we go from a special military operation to a fully fledged war. The argument therefore would also be that this gives Russia grounds to retaliate accordingly. There is now an urgent meeting taking place in the Kremlin to assess presumably that very decision to be whether it should be made or not. So what actually happened? Well, Russia's strategic bombers were destroyed by drone attacks launched from within Russia itself. Obviously, who was responsible? Well, the Ukrainians were, but then the argument's going to be where they provided intelligence by the United States, etc. We don't know. But the attack is significant. Apparently, it was coordinated from trucks inside the country that carried drones, and people will say, well, how did that happen? Well, Russia has enormous borders. It is very, very difficult to police every kilometer of those borders. But obviously, the question then is, how were these nuclear triad bombers attacked? Surely they should have been in hangars and protected, absolutely. So it was poor protection of these strategic bombers. And also the argument is, if, to all intents and purposes, they are at war, not in the context of what we're saying in this podcast. So they should have had far stricter security procedures in place to protect this military hardware, these strategic bombers. This will undoubtedly change the course of the war to some extent. And the question, therefore, is on this basis, we will find out exactly what happened. There are various different reports. Clearly, the Ukrainians seem to be egging and exaggerating the amount of planes that have been destroyed, strategic bombers, etc., and locations. But what's very telling is that there was one at the Belia Air Base in Russia's Irkutsk region, which is 4,000 kilometers from Ukrainian territory. The base holds Tu-22 M3, their long-range strike bombers. There are reports, and that has to be confirmed. This is from Siberia, of trucks parked at fueling stations. where a roof opened and they launched these drones towards the airbase. Obviously, they abandoned the vehicle, and there is apparently video footage showing the truck on fire and exploding during or after the launch. Now, according to certain confirmed assessments, and this remains to be seen, of course, and subject to verification, the 3 Tu-95 MS strategic bombers were destroyed. The 2 Tu-22M3 strategic bombers were hit, not destroyed, and an Antonov 12 military transport aircraft was damaged, stroke destroyed. Now, there are also claims that this operation was dubbed Operation Web. It was planned by Ukraine Security Service over a period of 18 months, and it required the use of these remote controlled trucks equipped with hidden launch platforms so they could have drones deployed from within Russian territory. That is a big escalation alone. It is a intelligence and security breach within Russia's borders. No doubt there's going to be some internal inquiry as to exactly how that happened. But you could also argue, of course, this is another escalation in how drone warfare works, because all of a sudden, there's going to now be an argument that says things like strategic bombers cease to have any relevance in future conflicts, wars, simply on the basis that they're like sitting ducks as well with regards to, obviously, this asymmetric drone warfare. The problem, of course, with this is these strategic bombers, if they're not being used, should have been in hangars, and that would have afforded them far more protection. So Putin will be holding a meeting, undoubtedly, with government members, Security Council sessions. Apparently that was stated on Russian television. It remains to be seen, as we said, what the Russian response will be. Now, there are, of course, going to be people who say, well, this is the end of Russia's war. Absolute nonsense. It is embarrassing as much as anything. It is, any strategic bomber that's damaged or destroyed is a problem, but it's not a major problem. And there will be people on both sides claiming it is, including on the Russian side, who will say it's the end of the world because that's what happens. And then there'll be people, obviously, on the Western side who'll claim it's a major victory in crushing Russia's war effort, which of course it's not. And what they fail to grasp is what the Russian response will be to this, and we have to hope it is measured. It doesn't turn into all-out war, because we've made this point many times before. If it does, the cost to Ukraine will be devastating, because the firepower they will deploy will be infinitely greater, should I say, than it has been in an SMO. And therefore, the question should have been in the mind of the West now, well, and the United States, what has Ukraine about unleashed upon itself because of its actions? And as I say, we have to wait and see precisely what that response will be. There was also claims of attacks on Russia's submarine base in Murmansk. That apparently isn't true. And there was no attack on Russia's naval base in Crimea. This point, I'm sure we'll get a proper official update as to exactly what was destroyed or damaged during this attack. But there is absolutely no doubt that this is, from my perspective, the biggest escalation in the war so far, simply on the basis that if you attack a nuclear triad, then that becomes a massive matter of national security in this context with respect to Russia itself. And there is no doubt there'll be some post-mortem as to how this was allowed to happen, because it shouldn't have happened, and somebody's heads will roll, not literally, but metaphorically. There'll be people fired as a result of this, because it will have caused some acute embarrassment to the Russians in some senses. But more importantly is what the Russian response will be as a result of this. And because there will be, there always is, whenever there is an escalation of some degree from the Ukrainians, Russia always responds. But this is the biggest escalation by a mile that we have seen so far in this war. Therefore, it will absolutely prompt a Russian response. We have to hope it's measured. And because ideally we don't want a Russian response, because this war is not anymore about a war with Ukraine. It's far bigger than that. It's what we've discussed recently. And at the end of the day, it's the Ukrainian people who will suffer enormously if Russia does decide, from their perspective, to change this from an SMO to obviously a fully fledged war. There is no doubt going to be conversations now had between the Ukrainians and the United States. Europe will not be part of this discussion. And I don't doubt that the comments made by the SBU publicly, if they're indeed confirmed, apparently it is the case, but I will say let's see them confirmed, does indeed mean that Ukraine has taken responsibility for attacking a component, albeit a small component, of Russia's nuclear triad. But that's Russia's nuclear security. That's the very heart of the defense of a nation. And therefore, they are opening themselves up to an enormously problematic response from the Russians. And that's why I thought it was worth putting this out pretty promptly, because if there is a Russian response, it will happen fairly rapidly. It's not likely to be something that will happen in days or a week. It is likely to happen within the next 12 hours to 24 hours, and probably sooner than 24 and more like 12, or maybe even sooner than that. But Russia will be deemed to have to respond to this because of public pressure, because of pressure inside the Kremlin. Because bearing in mind, Putin, even though Westerners don't believe this, has a far more moderate attitude than hardliners. There will be hardliners inside the Kremlin who will demand a maximum response to this, which is not the answer either. And as I said, in an ideal world, there wouldn't be a response. But inevitably, there is going to be. There always has been in the past. I say, given the gravity of what this escalation is, unfortunately, the response is likely, in a proportionate sense, to be far greater than anything we've seen thus far. And with that, we end today's podcast. Thank you very much for listening, for all your ongoing support. Please like, share, subscribe, and comment. And as I always say with regards to our podcast, never has it been more important to be informed rather than entertained. And with that, I'll say goodbye.